Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is race and segregation, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. So in the last lessons, you were learning about ethnicity, which is a group of people who share cultural traits. And now you're going to learn about race, which is a group of people with shared physical traits. We call these physical traits phenotypes, and unlike culture, which has to be learned, phenotypes are genetic, which means that people are born with them. Race is a super bizarre category because in some ways it's meaningless and in other ways it's incredibly meaningful. Let's start by looking at why it's meaningless. So aside from actual physical traits, there is no evidence that members of a race historically had anything else in common. And one way to imagine this is how some people today have a little hair growing on the knuckles of their hand. Maybe you do. But I bet you'd never thought to seek out other people who did or didn't have hair on their knuckles and try to bond with them. And I bet you've never judged anyone else based on whether they had hair on their knuckles or not. And that's what race is like. It's a collection of genetic traits, but it doesn't really mean anything. The thing is, in today's world, members of a race really do share actual things in common because through racism, our world has reified race. It has made it real. Imagine if the people that had no hair on their knuckles had enslaved the people that did have hair on their knuckles, and then not allowed them to go to school and made them live in polluted areas. And after a while, the people with the hair on their knuckles really would be different. They might have less education or maybe a lower life expectancy. And that's what race is like. It's a meaningless concept that has been given meaning through racism. And one way that race has been made real is through segregation, which is the enforced separation of racial groups. Let's look at 4 ways that this has happened. The first is called redlining, and it deals with home loans. Redlining is a bank's refusal to grant a loan to people of a certain race. And it's called redlining because banks and government lenders drew red lines on city maps around neighborhoods that had high numbers of non-white people living in them. They then used the maps to decide which people to give loans to, denying the loans to anyone who lived in the neighborhoods that they had outlined in red. For pretty much everyone, buying a home requires a loan because homes cost a lot of money. And the inability of certain races to obtain loans meant that they did not have freedom of where to live and were instead forced to live in certain areas. The second cause is called blockbusting, and that's when real estate agents exploited fears of immigration in order to scare white homeowners into selling their houses at low prices. Here's how it works. Real estate agents would go into white areas and tell homeowners there that non-white people would soon be moving into the neighborhood. And once that happened, the agents argued, housing prices in the neighborhood would fall and the homeowners would lose money. Therefore, the agents said, white homeowners needed to sell their homes and get out of the neighborhood quickly before the value of their homes dropped way down. Sometimes the agents would sell a single home to a black family in order to make it appear that the racial makeup of the neighborhood really was changing. Whites were persuaded to sell their homes quickly and at low prices, and real estate agents then resold the homes at higher values to black families. Essentially, real estate agents made money by preying on white homeowners' fears that their neighborhood would diversify. Blockbusting led to rapid turnover of a neighborhood's residents as whites moved out and minorities moved in. But when the white families left, where did they go? Well, after World War II, they increasingly left cities altogether and moved to places called suburbs. And this process was called white flight. White flight refers to the movement of white people out of cities and into suburbs. It started in the 1940s during a process called suburbanization, which you will learn a lot more about later in the year. As white people left cities, cities became mostly non-white, and suburbs became mostly white. Non-white families were unable to move to the suburbs because of redlining and because of a final cause of residential segregation: restrictive covenants. A restrictive covenant is an agreement forbidding the sale of a home to members of a certain race. When whites bought homes in the suburbs, they had to sign contracts, covenants, promising that they would never sell the house to a non-white person. So white people moved to suburbs while non-whites remained in the cities. And within cities, there continued to be neighborhoods that were mostly white and neighborhoods that were mostly non-white. All of this contributed to residential segregation. The last term is apartheid, which is a Dutch word meaning apartness. We don't usually use the term apartheid in the US, but apartheid often is used to describe the system of racial segregation that existed in South Africa until the 1990s. Apartheid was similar to the Jim Crow policies of the American South that you probably learned about in US history class. Okay, I want to end by looking at some racial dot maps of US cities and see what segregation looks like. On these maps, each person is represented as a dot at the location where they live, and the color of each dot represents that person's race. This information was collected using the US Census. In this map of Sacramento, California, I definitely see some segregation in this area, which is mostly white. On the other hand, I don't see a lot of segregation in these parts of the city down here because I see a mixture of colored dots, which means that people of different races are all living near each other. Based on this map, I would say that segregation in Sacramento is low to medium. But let's look at another city where segregation is more extreme. This is St. Louis, Missouri. North St. Louis, this entire northern portion of the city, is almost entirely black. South City, this southern section of the city, is mostly white, with small concentrated pockets where Hispanic residents live and some black residents. One sign that segregation is more extreme in a certain city is that you can see clear boundaries separating different racial groups. If you follow this line where my cursor is, this is probably a highway or a wide street, and you can see that it is crisply dividing black and white in this highly segregated city. Here's one more example: Chicago, Illinois. What do you think? Does this map indicate that segregation is low, medium, or high? Pause for a moment to think about it. I would say that Chicago is highly segregated because there are many areas with only one color of dot in them. The south side, this area down here, is mostly black, and the north side up here is mostly white. The west side over here is both black and Hispanic. And here we see a small ethnic enclave, which is Chinatown. If you're confused why I said Chicago is highly segregated, review the video and compare Chicago to the earlier map I showed you of Sacramento. All right, it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, rewind the video and look again. I will see you in class. Bye, students.